Imagine hearing that there are a number of people in history who have given up on something very crucially themselves in nature for faith, power, or an immortal legacy. This isn't just history, but it's a story about human desperation, devotion, and fear, all wrapped in a shocking story. Let's go back in time to the year 529 CE. Before we begin, remember to give this video a like if you're ready to uncover more forgotten tales of history. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference. Deep within the core of the Byzantine Empire, a young man, Sporus, stands on his knees before an elder priest in the dimly lit monastery. His hands shake, not with fear, but because of his faith. He was about to make a life decision. The air was heavy with damp stone and the stench of burned incense, a crude blade upon the altar in the light of the flickering torches. Sporus whispered his prayer for strength, nodded to the priest, and the silence was suddenly cut by the rasp of metal across skin. The deed was done. Yet upon Sporus, this was not punishment, nor was it imposed on him. It was his choice, a step he felt would bring him closer to God. But why would such an unimaginable thing be wanted to be performed on oneself? Far from an isolated act, history stands witness to hordes of persons who have voluntarily submitted to castration. Spiritual enlightenment, political ambition, personal survival, or even devotion to art are the reasons one finds. Each story says a lot about how far humankind can go, to the great lengths for things they believe in. Let's start with the most striking example, the Galli priests of the goddess Cybele. The men served in ancient Rome, enacting rituals which were so intense they bordered on the unthinkable. The Galli felt that castrating themselves was a method of achieving divinity with the mother goddess Cybele. They would go into frenzied states of dance and chanting during the spring festivals. In one quick, climactic moment, over to ecstasy or divine fervor, they would toss the act of self-castration with sharp stones or knives. The blood flowed into the sacred vessels as the crowd around them burst into chaotic celebration. To us, this may be very barbaric. In their view, it was a gate into divine transformation. But devotion wasn't always about ecstatic rituals. In the early Christian era, we find men like Origen of Alexandria. Origen was one of the most brilliant theologians of his time, a man who shaped early Christian thought. His devotion to purity led him down a rather more controversial path. However, to avoid temptation and to stay spiritually pure, Origen castrated himself. He believed this was the sacrifice needed to follow through with Christ's teaching. Ironically, the very church that he tried to honor later labeled his actions as heretical. Faith was not the only motive for self-castration. In ancient China, castration was usually a well-calculated step on the road to influence and power. Eunuchs held great prominence in the Ming and Qing dynasty royal courts, being confidants, guards who barred the way to the emperor, and unusually influential politically. Why eunuchs? Well, the reasoning was simple, but brutal. Not having families, eunuchs were considered faithful servants without motive to betray their rulers. The steep price they paid for such loyalty was voluntary castration. Take the infamous example of Wei Zhongxian, who rose from a common eunuch to one of the most powerful figures of Ming Dynasty China. By giving up his manhood, Wei put himself in the position of the emperor's closest confidant, hence having control over court politics, not to mention influencing military decisions as well. His story does indeed show that ambition and sacrifice go hand in glove. Yet for many, this ambition was not of their own making. Desperate families in abject poverty at times forced their sons to castration with the hope of securing them places in the royal court. Castration to them wasn't an act of free choice, but an odious need linked with subsistence. But that is not all there is to it. In 17th and 18th century Europe, another group of men gave up their masculinity, not for faith, not for power, and most definitely not for love for art. These were the Castrati, male singers who had been castrated before puberty to retain angelic, high-pitched voices. They were the superstars of their time, with their performances being staged in major operas. This brought them both fame and a lot of money. With voices that uniquely combined male power with female purity, the Castrati led Europe in awe. Farinelli was one of the most renowned castrati. He was celebrated not as a singer, but as a cultural colossus. The price they paid for such a life was gigantic indeed. Physical and emotional challenges faced them, such as health complications or the ridicule of society. Some, like Farinelli, were made famous, while others lived lives of quiet desperation. Other stories of castration are less chiaroscuro. In some cultures, children were forcibly castrated and sold into servitude. In the Ottoman Empire, boys were enslaved and castrated for use as harem guards. Poor Italian families would send their sons to be castrated in the hope of earning their families a great deal of money by becoming castrato singers. These children had no say in their fate. For them, castration was not a spiritual or artistic calling. It was a cruel consequence of poverty and exploitation. The unsettling truth is that while we may consider castration an extreme, unimaginable act, throughout history, it has always been inextricably linked with human survival, ambition, and devotion. Some practiced it for religious or political reasons. Others did it due to the brutal hand of destiny. Yet it's not the action itself which is most shocking, but the fact that these stories aren't necessarily that far removed, as it may initially seem to us. Those stresses leading individuals to those extremes, poverty, societal pressures, religiosity, are very much still here with us, even now, but in other ways. What does it all mean, then? Underpinning it all, the history of voluntary castration is less about the act than it is about what the act means, sacrifice and willpower, and how far people go for what they believe in. And while we are not faced with these choices today, the question still begs, what would you give up for your beliefs, your family, or your legacy? History has shown time and again how the human spirit can change in extraordinary ways, for better or worse. History tends to question us at times. Now it's time the question bounces back to you. Where does a story fall into? Being one of bravery, desperation, or just something entirely different? Leave a comment below. Your thought might just inspire our next deep dive. Thanks for watching. Like this video if you found it interesting. Subscribe for more engrossing history and share it with someone who loves uncovering the unexpected. Until next time, stay curious.